Alleluia. Alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of men, for they will hand you over to courts and scourge you in their synagogues. You will be led before governors and kings for my sake, as a witness before them and the pagans. When they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say. You will be given at that moment what you are to say. For it will not be you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will hand over brother to death, and the father his child. Children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But whoever endures to the end will be saved." The Gospel of the Lord. Today is the feast of St. Stephen. We get to the Christmas season and we have the joyous feast of Christmas, and then we have all of these feasts during daily Mass of the first martyrs, right, of the church, beginning with St. Stephen. St. Stephen is, if you're into Bible studies and things like that, Acts chapter 7. St. Stephen gives the longest speech in the entire book of Acts, and it's a very fascinating speech that he gives. It really gives you an insight into the thoughts of the early church. He gives basically a summary of the Old Testament leading up to the days of Jesus. And you see a number of things in there. He talks about how even though the Jews are worshiping in the temple, God needs no temple. And so he basically prophesies about the judgment that is about to come down upon the temple. Stephen also talks about the law given at Mount Sinai through the mediation of angels, which was a very common idea in antiquity, right? Even though it's not explicitly said in the book of Exodus. St. Stephen also talks about how it was the people in Jerusalem who had always persecuted God's prophets, right? And so when you see in the book of Acts and later on, when you see the Jewish religious authorities being the number one enemies of the Christians, right, it shouldn't surprise you, because often that was the way it was in the Old Testament. It was Jerusalem which became a great persecutor of God's prophets. Also, what's very interesting about St. Stephen was one of the first deacons, right? In fact, he is the first deacon named in the Acts of the Apostles. A beautiful thing about being Catholic is we have our hierarchy of the clergy, right? And many Protestants wonder, why do we have this hierarchy? Again, it's a reflection of the fact that we are fulfilling the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there was a three-part hierarchy of the clergy back then as well. There was the high priest, and then there were the Levitical priests, and then there were the Levitical non-priests who basically assisted the priests in offering sacrifice. And so we as Catholics, as we see in the book of Acts, right, there are the bishops, and then the priests, and then finally the deacons, right? Also kind of interesting about St. Stephen, he was named one of the first 7 deacons. Why the number 7? Interestingly, all of the deacons seem to be Gentile Christians. And it just so happens that in the Old Testament, when the Exodus began and the people of Israel started traveling to the Promised Land, it just so happens that there were 7 Gentile nations living in the Promised Land at that time, right? And so it's kind of representative of this being a new Exodus. And so if you want to have a really good Bible study in summary format on the Old Testament, you can read Acts chapter 7, this whole speech of St. Stephen. There's a number of things that we can learn from this feast of St. Stephen. St. Stephen, as we read, he was arguing against the so-called synagogue of freedmen, and nobody could withstand his wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. One of the charisms that we are supposed to have as Christians is the wisdom and the fullness of the Spirit to withstand, right, the different errors and evil thoughts and ideologies of our day. Right? We are supposed to have wisdom and to be able to withstand the lies the culture brings to us. We also see a spiritual reality here in the Feast of St. Stephen. That the entire first part of the book of Acts is talking about the great triumph of the early church. There is the Feast of Pentecost. There is the spreading of the gospel. There is the institution of the deacons. And then, of course, when the church is triumphant, what happens? The great resistor builds up his forces against the movement of the Spirit. And these so-called members of the synagogue of free men, rather than being cut to the heart as the people of Pentecost and being drawn to conversion, these are cut to the heart and filled with rage against God's kingdom. It is the devil beginning to influence those early Jewish authorities in the early days of the church. It should be a reminder to us that whenever the church does pick up steam, whenever the church does begin to do great things, whenever you are in a diocese or a parish which starts to accomplish great things for God, sure enough, the devil will enter in and try to destroy what is taking place. He will also do it in individual Christians. When individual Christians begin to catch fire for their faith, when they start to attend more often, or pray more often, or begin to study and learn their faith, beware, because the devil will enter in, and he will want to resist the good that is happening in that person's soul. And so, inspired by St. Stephen, we should ask God for the gift of the Spirit to withstand the different errors and lies in our culture. We should ask for the wisdom and the Spirit to withstand the different temptations that the devil will bring to our parish, and also to withstand the temptations that he will bring to our own personal spiritual lives, trying to distract us from growing closer to Christ. If we withstand, if we persevere, pray God, we might also be triumphant one day in heaven, wearing a crown. The name Stephen literally is the Greek word for a crown, the triumphant and victorious one, St. Stephen.